I thought losing my husband would be the hardest part, until the lawyer read the words he left behind. If she cries, she gets nothing. In front of his entire family. He tried to control me one last time, even from the grave. They waited for me to break. But I didn't. And when the will reached its final line, the room turned against them instead of me. I didn't just keep my composure. I uncovered secrets he never meant for anyone to find. This is the story of how his final test became the beginning of my freedom. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The chairs in the attorney's office were lined up too neatly, as if someone anticipated disorder and tried to prevent it with perfect symmetry. I took a seat in the corner, away from the polished conference table where my husband used to sit during meetings like these, tapping his pen, reminding everyone he was the one in control. The air smelled like old books and polished wood, his favorite scent. The room filled slowly. His brother came first, offering me a stiff nod, the kind reserved for someone you pity but don't actually want to comfort. Then came his grown children, Leon and Marissa, dressed in mourning clothes that still somehow looked rehearsed, their expressions hovering between concern and calculation. They didn't look at me, not directly. Just enough to make sure I saw them wiping their eyes at the right moments. The receptionist whispered condolences, eyes darting between us as if she already sensed tension brewing beneath the calm surface. When the attorney, Mr. Levine, finally entered, the room settled into a careful stillness. He placed a thick folder on the table, its edges worn from years of being moved, reviewed, and prepared long before anyone knew it would become relevant. He looked at me longer than the others, searching my face as if trying to predict how much of what he was about to say would break me. I stared back steadily. I had practiced this expression for years. Calm, smooth, unreadable. The mask that once kept the peace at home now served me here. "We're here," he began, "to read the last will and testament of Mr. Adrian Hale." The formal tone was unnecessary. Everyone already knew why they were gathered, but rituals have a way of giving people something to hold on to. Papers rustled. Leon leaned forward. Marissa folded her hands dramatically, preparing for grief. Then came the line. The one that made the room inhale all at once. "To my wife," the attorney read slowly, each word measured, "I leave the entirety of our marital estate under one condition. If she sheds a single tear during or after this reading, she forfeits everything." Silence thickened instantly. Eyes shot toward me, wide, eager, almost predatory. Even the attorney paused, waiting. They expected shock. They expected trembling. They expected the woman they had always seen at Adrian's side. Quiet, obedient, pliable. A woman who cried behind closed doors because it was the only place tears were allowed. But that woman had died long before Adrian did. I kept my gaze on a tiny crack in the wooden table, the kind no one notices unless they are desperately searching for something to steady themselves with. I breathed in slowly, held it, then released it just as quietly. No tears. No sound. Not even the flicker of an eyelid. Marissa exhaled in disappointment. Leon muttered something under his breath. The attorney cleared his throat, both relieved and unnerved. I folded my hands on my lap, feeling the weight of their expectation pressing against me. They were waiting for me to fall apart. I didn't. I simply sat still, steady as stone, and waited for the rest. People used to tell me how lucky I was. They said it with soft smiles and admiring eyes every time Adrian held my hand at gatherings, every time he rested a protective palm on the small of my back, every time he leaned in to kiss my cheek at the precise moment someone happened to be watching. Women whispered that I had found a good one. Men envied the way he kept his household in order. Our Christmas cards showed the perfect couple smiling in front of a towering fir tree, coordinated outfits, matching watches he insisted we wear. Every photo looked like a promise fulfilled. But a picture is only ever a moment, a carefully arranged one at that. It never shows the silence that comes after. Behind closed doors, perfection had rules. Adrian liked to say marriage worked best when two people knew their place. His place was at the head of everything: conversations, decisions, finances, even the space in a room. Mine was everywhere behind him. He insisted it was love, that he only wanted what was best for me, that the world was too harsh for a woman as delicate as I was. Any disagreement became proof of disrespect. Any independent thought was a challenge. He could turn a quiet dinner into a courtroom trial over something as small as the seasoning on the chicken or the way I folded the laundry. He rationed affection like it was currency. A kiss if I apologized for something I didn't do. A compliment if I stayed quiet during a discussion he deemed too complex for me. Flowers if I forgave him quickly enough. He had a gift for making me feel grateful for the bare minimum. I learned early that crying made everything worse. He called tears manipulative, a tool women use to gain power. So I swallowed them one by one, until my throat ached from holding back what my heart couldn't release. To the world he was impressive, successful, charismatic, dependable. He volunteered at charity events, gave speeches about integrity, always shook hands firmly and looked people in the eye. But at home, his voice could slice through me without ever rising above a whisper. He never needed to shout. His disappointment was heavier than anger. His silence more punishing than any raised voice. Friends drifted away over time, not because they didn't love me, but because he made it exhausting for them to stay. He claimed they influenced me. He said I didn't need anyone else. Slowly I believed it. Slowly I became exactly what he wanted. Someone who measured her words, her steps, her breaths. And yet, the world kept telling me how lucky I was. Funny how no one ever notices that a woman can disappear without ever leaving a room. The final month began the way most endings do. Quietly. A missed step here, a wince there, a sudden shortness of breath he tried to mask with a forced laugh. Adrian was a man who prided himself on control, and the betrayal of his own body enraged him more than any argument we had ever had. At first, he insisted it was nothing. A little fatigue, he said. A small cough. But the cough grew heavier, the fatigue deeper. And soon the once commanding figure who filled every room began to shrink inside his own skin. Doctors spoke in careful tones, softening truths he refused to hear. He dismissed every suggestion, rest, medication, tests, until denial became a luxury he could no longer afford. When he finally agreed to treatment, it was already too late. I accompanied him to every appointment, not because I was clinging to him, but because I had made vows long before I understood the weight of them. Duty has a strange way of binding itself to routine, and routine is what kept me steady. I scheduled his pills, monitored his oxygen levels, kept track of his diet, and held the bucket when he couldn't keep anything down. He hated needing me. Hated the way his hands trembled. Hated that the man who once commanded boardrooms now struggled to lift a glass of water. Illness strips ego faster than anything else, and with each day he became more bitter, as if I personally orchestrated his decline. Some nights he lay awake breathing harshly, calling my name just to accuse me of sleeping too soundly, of not caring enough, of secretly enjoying his weakness. I ignored the bait. I had learned long ago that responding only fed the fire. One evening, after a particularly brutal coughing spell, he stared at me with eyes that had lost all their sharpness. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, propped up by pillows, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. I wiped it away gently, out of habit more than tenderness. His voice cracked when he spoke, but the venom was still there, diluted yet recognizable. "You won't survive without me," he whispered. "You'll fall apart the moment I'm gone." I didn't respond. I didn't flinch. I simply adjusted his blanket. He took my silence as weakness, as he always had. What he didn't understand, what he never understood, was that silence had become my strength long before his heart began to fail. When the end came, it was early in the morning, the sky still dark, the world hushed. He exhaled once, long and shuddering, and didn't inhale again. I sat beside him, listening to the stillness settle around the room like dust. I waited for the rush of grief people talk about, the collapse, the wailing. But nothing broke inside me. Nothing fell apart. Felt steady. I closed his eyes with a hand that didn't tremble. Not from coldness. Simply from knowing that the part of my life defined by his shadow had finally, quietly, ended. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside, as if it had been holding its breath the entire time I was gone. Afternoon light filtered through the blinds in narrow stripes, falling across the hardwood floor like silent reminders of all the years I spent trying to walk softly enough not to disturb him. The air was too still, too clean, almost rehearsed, much like the life we lived here. I closed the door quietly out of habit, though there was no one left to criticize the sound. The lock clicked into place, echoing louder than it ever had before. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust to the familiar shape of my own home. It was unsettling how every corner still carried his fingerprints. The framed artwork he had chosen because it reflected our standards. The rug he insisted on importing from some faraway store because cheap things cheapen people. Even the arrangement of the furniture felt rigid, positioned not for comfort but for visual control. I remembered the day I once tried to move a chair closer to the window. He spent an hour explaining how my choices disrupted the harmony of the room. After that, I stopped rearranging anything. I walked into the living room. The leather armchair he always sat in faced the television at a perfect angle. His angle. I had never dared sit there, not even when he was gone for business trips. That chair had rules. Don't touch it. Don't place anything on the armrest. Don't leave fingerprints on the polished wood frame. Now, standing in front of it, I realized it looked smaller without him in it, more like an object than a throne. Still, I didn't sit. Not yet. Some habits take longer to die than the people who created them. The kitchen was next. The place where he monitored everything from how much salt I used to how often I replaced the dish sponge. He liked to stand behind me while I cooked, commenting on the temperature, the timing, the appearance of the plate. "No man wants a wife who can't manage her home," he would say, tapping my shoulder as if delivering advice rather than a warning. I brushed my fingers across the cold granite countertop, remembering all the meals I had prepared with a tight throat and a forced smile. I wandered down the hallway and paused at the doorway of our bedroom. His sanctuary, my boundary line. The bed was still made the way he preferred, sheets tucked so tightly you could bounce a coin off them. I remembered the nights he insisted I sleep closer or further away depending on his mood, the mornings he criticized my posture, the days he reminded me how lucky I was that he chose me at all. The mirror on the dresser reflected my face back to me, a face that had learned not to show emotion, not to crack under scrutiny, not to reveal the countless moments of dread disguised as devotion. In the closet, his shirts hung in perfect rows, organized by color, then by fabric. I could still hear him lecturing me about how to fold them, how to wash them, how to maintain order. I closed the closet door gently, not because I feared a reprimand, but because I felt the weight of years pressing against my ribs. The house was silent now, but it wasn't empty. It held every command he ever issued, every expectation he wrapped in false affection, every punishment he excused with the words, "It's because I love you." And yet, for the first time, I was walking through it without shrinking, without apology, without fear that he would appear behind me with a disapproving sigh or a knowing smirk. The ghosts were still here, yes, but so was I, and that changed everything. They arrived at the house before the sun had finished setting, their expensive car pulling into the driveway with the same arrogance their father once carried into every room. I watched from the kitchen window as Leon slammed the car door harder than necessary, his face tight with irritation, while Marissa adjusted her coat and sunglasses as if she were stepping out onto a stage rather than into a grieving home. They didn't come to offer comfort. They came to confirm a victory they believed was already theirs. When I opened the door, they didn't bother masking their disdain. Leon brushed past me without a greeting, heading straight for the living room as if it already belonged to him. Marissa gave me a thin smile, the kind that held no warmth, only polite contempt. "We just wanted to check in," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. "It must be overwhelming for you." Overwhelming. That was the word she always used, as if emotions were fragile glass and I was too clumsy to handle them. She used to mimic my voice behind my back, softening it, weakening it, until it sounded pathetic even to my own ears. Her father never stopped her. If anything, he smirked, enjoying the show. They had inherited more from him than his jawline and ambition. They had inherited his talent for cruelty. Leon sank into their father's leather armchair, spreading his arms across it as if claiming territory. "Dad always said you were sensitive," he remarked. "I can't imagine you handled the will reading well." Marissa perched on the edge of the sofa, inspecting her nails. "I mean, you didn't cry, right?" she added. "It would be such a shame to lose everything on a technicality. They already assumed everything belonged to them. The house, the investments, the businesses, every asset Adrian ever touched. In their minds, I had simply been a placeholder, a decorative addition to their father's life story. They never saw the years I spent caring for him, supporting him, sacrificing parts of myself to maintain the illusion of a happy family. To them, I was always the outsider, the intruder, the woman who dared stand beside their father in photographs they believed should have been reserved for their mother. When they realized I wasn't answering, Marissa's expression sharpened. "You know, Dad always worried you were fragile," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "He said you'd fall apart without him. That's why he made things so conditional." She laughed lightly, as if the humiliation were amusing rather than cruel. Leon leaned forward. "Look, we're not heartless. Once everything transfers to us, we can discuss an arrangement. Something fair." His definition of fair had always been synonymous with self-serving. "Maybe we can let you stay here for a few months," he continued. "Just until you find something smaller. Something more manageable." I stood there, hands folded, letting their words settle around me like dust. They were so sure their father's conditions would destroy me, so certain that my silence meant surrender. What neither of them understood, what Adrian himself had never understood, was that silence was not weakness. It was endurance, survival, strategy. I met their eyes one at a time, steady, unblinking. For the first time they looked unsettled. My stillness confused them. My calm irritated them. My lack of fear threw off the rhythm they expected to control. They didn't know that the will had already been read. They didn't know that I had passed the test their father designed. They didn't know that their inheritance depended entirely on whether I cried. And I hadn't. Their smirks, their arrogance, their mockery, it didn't break me. It only reminded me of something I had forgotten. They were all just reflections of the man who could no longer touch me. Let them laugh now. They would not be laughing for long. My sister arrived the next morning without calling first, just as she used to when we were young and storms rolled through the neighborhood. She always seemed to sense when something was about to break. The moment I opened the door, she pulled me into her arms before I could even greet her, holding me tightly as if she feared I might drift away with the slightest wind. I didn't melt into her embrace the way I once did. I didn't collapse or sob or release everything I'd been carrying, but I did feel something loosen in my chest, something that had been wound tight for far too long. She stepped inside and looked around the house, her eyes scanning the polished surfaces, the perfect lines, the neatness that had been mistaken for harmony. She shook her head softly. "Still feels like him," she murmured. "Even now." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she used to visit me years ago before Adrian's disapproval made her visits less frequent. The last time she had been here, he spent the evening criticizing her career, her car, her voice, anything he could pick apart to remind her she didn't belong in the world he crafted. She never said it directly, but I knew that day marked the beginning of her stepping back. Not out of lack of love, but out of respect for how tightly he controlled the walls around me. "I heard about the will," she said gently, wrapping her hands around the mug I placed in front of her. "They're already talking." Course they were. News like that spreads fast, especially when people think there's weakness to feast on. She looked at me carefully, searching for a crack I refused to give anyone else. "Did you cry?" she asked. But she already knew the answer. I shook my head. She let out a long breath, part relief, part sorrow. "He never stopped trying to control you. Not even in death." We talked then, really talked, for the first time in years. Not about funerals or wills or the children who had come by with arrogance in their eyes. We talked about the things I had hidden under layers of silence. The ways Adrian chipped away at my confidence, disguised his criticism as guidance, turned apologies into currency. How he isolated me slowly, one friend at a time, one boundary at a time, until the world outside this house became something distant and unreachable. She reached across the table and took my hand, the gesture warm and familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. "I was waiting for you to tell me," she whispered. "All those times you said you were fine, I knew you weren't. But you were so deep inside it, I didn't know how to pull you out." I stared at our intertwined hands, remembering how many times Adrian told me she was jealous, influential, not good for my image. And how quickly I believed him, because believing him was easier than questioning the foundation of my marriage. "If I had told you everything back then," I said softly, "I think I would have had to admit it to myself too." Tears pricked my eyes, dangerously close, but they stayed where they were. I blinked them back, steadying my breath. My sister squeezed my hand. "You don't owe anyone tears," she said. "Not him. Not his children. Not the people waiting to see you break. You survived him. You don't have to perform grief now." We sat there for a long time, the house unusually quiet, as if it too was listening. The truth of my marriage, the truth I had carried alone for years, now lay between us on the table. Visible, undeniable, no longer hidden. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone inside the walls he once used to contain me. My sister was here. She always had been. I just finally had space to let her in. By the end of the week, the Will's condition had spread through town like a spark racing across dry grass. People pretended not to stare when I walked into the grocery store, but their eyes lingered a little too long. Conversations quieted when I passed. Some offered sympathetic smiles, the kind usually given to someone who has endured unbearable tragedy. Others watched me with morbid fascination, as if waiting for the moment I finally cracked. Grief was expected. Tears were expected. A widow who didn't cry, especially one whose inheritance depended on it, became something to talk about. Someone at the florist whispered that it was cruel. Another at the pharmacy muttered that it was ingenious. But most people seemed unsure of what to make of me. I could feel it in the way they tilted their heads, studying my face, searching for red eyes or trembling lips. They wanted confirmation that I was human enough to hurt, vulnerable enough to break, tragic enough to satisfy the story spreading from mouth to mouth. Yet every time I remained composed, their confusion grew. The ones most invested in seeing me fall apart, however, were Adrian's children. They showed up more frequently, too frequently, under the pretense of checking on me, but always with the same sharp, hungry focus. They hovered, watching my reactions to everything. Every word they spoke was a probe. Every silence between us was a trap. One afternoon, Marissa positioned herself at the foot of the stairs, arms crossed, pretending to scroll on her phone while I dusted the picture frames on the wall. She kept glancing up as if waiting to see my hand slip, my breath hitch, or my face crumble. "It's okay to cry, you know," she said finally, her tone falsely sweet. "It might even help." Help her, maybe. Not me. Later, Leon followed me into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as I washed a mug. He watched the water run over my hands for an uncomfortably long time, as though expecting to see my shoulders shake with sobs. "Dad meant a lot to you," he said. "You must miss him." The words weren't compassionate, they were bait. I dried the mug carefully and set it on the rack. "Missing someone doesn't always look the way you think it does," I replied, meeting his stare. He blinked, thrown off by the steadiness in my voice. Their attempts grew bolder. They brought up old memories at random moments, stories designed to pull at the edges of sentimentality. They left photos lying around of vacations and holidays, hoping something inside me would shatter. They even tried to provoke guilt, asking if I wished I had done more during his final days. But I didn't rise to any of it. I didn't tremble. I didn't react. They didn't know that tears had long ago become a luxury I learned to live without. Meanwhile, the outside world continued its quiet surveillance. At the post office, I overheard two women debating whether I was in shock or cold. At the bakery, the cashier gave me a free pastry, whispering, "You don't deserve this madness." At church, a man patted my shoulder solemnly and told me, "God sees what others don't," which almost made me smile because it was the closest thing to understanding anyone had offered. But understanding, even sympathy, was irrelevant. I didn't need the town to believe in my grief. I didn't need Adrian's children to believe in my innocence. I didn't need anyone's approval or validation. All I needed was control. And the silence I had once been forced into was now the silence I wielded with precision. Every breath I took without breaking became a reminder, not just to them but to myself, that power had shifted. They were the ones waiting. They were the ones watching. They were the ones afraid of what I might do next. And I remained calm, steady, calculating, because the condition meant nothing to me anymore. But watching them unravel over it, that was something I had never expected to enjoy. Silence wasn't something I was born with. It wasn't a natural softness or a gentle temperament the way people like to assume. It was learned, slowly, painfully, piece by piece, until it settled into my bones like a second skeleton. I could trace it back to the early days of our marriage, long before the polished photos and the carefully curated image of us as the couple everyone envied. In the beginning, Adrian made silence seem like a compliment. He praised me for being mature, for not raising my voice, for staying composed when other women would overreact. He would smile, kiss my forehead and say things like, "You're so easy to love when you're calm." Those words felt like affection back then, even though they were warnings disguised as warmth. The first time I cried in front of him, it was over something small. I had burned dinner because I was trying to juggle too many things at once. The moment he saw my eyes welling up, his entire expression shifted. His jaw tightened. His voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "Don't do that," he said. "Crying doesn't fix mistakes. It only makes you look weak." I swallowed the sob, apologized, and promised it wouldn't happen again. That night, he brought frozen meals home and said he was taking care of things, as if my tears had proven my incompetence. The next morning he was affectionate again. Too affectionate, as if rewarding obedience. After that, I learned to swallow emotions before they reached my face. Another time years later I told him I felt lonely. It was the truth, a small truth spoken softly, more like a confession than a complaint. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply tilted his head and said, "Maybe if you tried harder to keep me interested, you wouldn't feel that way." Then he walked away, leaving me standing there with the ache still in my chest and a new lesson carved into it. Vulnerability was ammunition he would use without hesitation. Silence became the only safe place to exist. I practiced it the way others practice music or art. I learned how to keep my face smooth even when my heart raced. How to steady my breathing when disappointment tightened my throat. How to look at him without showing the sting of his words. My expressions became controlled, measured, crafted with the precision of someone who understood that one wrong twitch could start a storm. People praised me for being composed. Adrian's friends called me graceful, elegant, so well behaved. He loved parading that image around, telling others he had married a woman who didn't bring chaos. They never realized my silence wasn't grace. It was fear disguised as poise. Over the years I became an expert at stillness. I learned to sit through his criticisms without reacting. I learned to nod when he lectured me about friends I wasn't allowed to see, clothes he didn't want me wearing, dreams he thought were childish. I learned to hold myself perfectly in place when he sighed in disappointment, the sound sharper than a blade. It wasn't just emotional control. It was physical. My shoulders stayed relaxed even when anger clawed at me. My hands stayed steady even when shame burned behind my ribs. My eyes stayed dry even when sadness crept up my throat. And the world saw none of it. To them, I was simply a quiet woman married to a powerful man. They admired my calm. never questioning why it existed, never noticing that my silence was not peace. It was survival. Ironically, the stillness he had trained into me became the very thing that protected me after his death. Everyone expected me to fall apart, to cry, to break. But I had spent years learning how not to. In the end, the skill he drilled into me, the one he used to maintain control, became the one thing he could no longer influence. Silence had saved me then. Silence was saving me now. The discovery began with something small, almost laughably small, considering what it would unravel. I was cleaning out his home office, a room I rarely entered because it had always been his domain, arranged according to rules too precise to disrupt. The desk drawers still smelled like his cologne, a sharp scent that once made my stomach knot with anticipation of whatever mood he might be in. I opened each drawer gently, half expecting his voice to bark a correction from the shadows. But the house stayed silent, and the silence emboldened me. I found the ledger book in the third drawer, tucked behind a stack of envelopes and an old fountain pen. It was bound in dark leather, the kind he liked for its professional appearance. At first, I thought it was just another work ledger. Adrian kept books for everything, from investments to the number of hours he spent at the gym. But this one was different. There was no company logo, no category markers, no dates written neatly at the corners. The handwriting was smaller, tighter, almost secretive. Curiosity pricked at me, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself in years. I flipped to the first page, expecting business expenses or client payments. Instead, I found transfers. Large ones, reoccurring ones, names I didn't recognize, accounts I had never heard him mention. The columns of numbers didn't make sense at first, but a feeling settled over me. Something cold, something unmistakable. He had been hiding money. A lot of it. I sat down slowly, the weight of this revelation settling like dust on my skin. The ledger wasn't an anomaly. It was a map he never expected me to navigate. I searched the office more thoroughly, opening drawers I had once left untouched, digging through folders, receipts, and documents he would have scolded me for even glancing at. In a locked box under the bottom drawer, one I pried open with a screwdriver, I found bank statements from institutions I had never heard him speak of. Cayman Islands, Zurich, Singapore. The numbers made my breath catch, but not in the way he once could. He had more money than his children even imagined, more than he ever allowed the world to see, and more than he clearly intended anyone to inherit without strings. I found receipts for cash withdrawals disguised as travel expenses, payments made to someone with only initials, and deposits that came from a company I knew didn't exist. He had always been meticulous, but even meticulous men get sloppy in their arrogance. He never thought I would see these. He never imagined I would look. In his mind, curiosity was a trait I lacked, something he trained out of me long ago. The longer I sorted through the evidence, the more I saw the truth. He hadn't trusted anyone. Not me, not his children, not his business partners. His entire life had been one elaborate performance, with only one audience member knowledgeable enough to appreciate it: himself. But now I saw everything. A picture formed slowly, piece by piece. Investments hidden in shell companies. Properties under false names. Emergency funds that suggested a man preparing for betrayals he never admitted to. I began organizing it all, placing documents in piles, grouping accounts by geography, sorting transactions chronologically. The careful, silent skill he once praised became the key to understanding the man he tried so hard to conceal. By evening, his financial life lay exposed across the dining table. Layers of secrets sprawled out like a confession he never gave. And I realized something then, something sharp, almost electric. He had spent years believing silence made me blind. But silence had made me observant. While he underestimated me, I had learned to see everything. Every pattern, every inconsistency, every lie tucked behind a smile. And now, finally, I was piecing together a life he thought I was too small to uncover. How ironic, I thought as I stacked another set of statements. He wanted me quiet. He never expected quiet would be the thing that exposed him. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Mr. Levine handed it to me at the end of our meeting. His expression tight, almost apologetic, as if he wished he could refuse the task. He waited until Adrian's children had stepped out to argue in the hallway before leaning closer and lowering his voice. "He asked me to give this to you privately," he said. "And only after the initial reading." His eyes searched mine, trying to gauge how much strength I had left. I offered none of what he was looking for. No trembling lip, no watery eyes. Just a quiet nod. He hesitated, then placed the envelope in my hands. It was sealed with a wax stamp bearing Adrian's initials. Dramatically unnecessary, unmistakably him. I left the office without speaking to anyone. Leon and Marissa were too busy whispering furiously to notice the envelope clutched against my chest. Outside, the wind carried the hint of rain, but the sky held itself together, refusing to open. I walked home at a steady pace, the weight of the letter growing heavier with every step. Inside the house, I stood in the entryway for a long moment, staring at the wax seal. It felt wrong to open it anywhere near the places where he used to sit, where his voice still echoed in the walls. So I walked into the backyard and sat at the wrought iron table under the old maple tree, the one part of the property he never controlled because nature had always irritated him. The leaves rustled gently, a sound that felt like the world breathing around me rather than pressing down on me. Broke the seal. The paper tore with a soft rip that sent a strange calm through me. Inside, there was a single folded sheet of thick stationery. His handwriting, sharp and immaculate, stretched across the page. For a moment, I braced myself for something sentimental. A confession, perhaps, or a farewell laced with regret. But I should have known better. The letter was a list. Not a goodbye. Not an apology. A list of every flaw he believed I had. Lines and lines of criticisms written with the precision of someone cataloging inventory. He called me emotionally fragile, unimpressive, a burden he carried out of obligation. He wrote about how easily I cried, how pathetic it was to watch. He wrote that I never lived up to his expectations, that I lacked ambition, that I relied too heavily on others. He wrote that my silence made me weak. He ended with a final note, one last twist of the knife. "If this breaks you, I was right about you all along." My hand tightened around the paper, but nothing inside me cracked. I read every line slowly, letting the words sit in the air, hearing them the way he would have spoken them. Calmly, coldly, with that familiar edge of disappointment. Felt no tears. Not even the sting of one. Because these were not new wounds. They were old ones, familiar ones, injuries I had long since cauterized. Every insult was a repetition, a refrain from a life already lived and survived. He had written the letter to provoke me, to orchestrate one final collapse. But I didn't collapse. I didn't fold. I refolded the paper with steady hands and slipped it back into the envelope. The tree above me rustled softly, as if in approval, and the world stayed steady beneath my feet. His last attempt at control had failed. Spectacularly. He wanted to prove I was weak. All he proved was that he never truly knew me at all. They arrived without calling, pounding on the door with the impatience of people who believed they had already won. I had barely finished setting the kettle on the stove when Leon's voice boomed from the porch, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Open the door!" he shouted, as if the house already belonged to him. I walked slowly, not because I feared them, but because rushing had never helped anyone in this family. When I opened it, both of them pushed their way inside without waiting for permission. Marissa was dressed in black again, though somehow it looked less like mourning and more like strategy. She scanned the living room with sharp, assessing eyes, taking inventory of what she believed would soon be hers. Leon rubbed his hands together as if preparing for a negotiation he expected to dominate. His jaw was set in that same rigid shape his father's used to take when he planned to get his way. "We need access to everything," he declared. "Dad wouldn't have wanted the house locked up like this." I glanced around. Nothing was locked. Nothing was out of place. The only thing close to them was the truth they refused to accept. Marissa circled the room like a cat marking territory. We know he left things behind. Documents. Counts. We're here to collect what's ours. The entitlement in her voice was almost theatrical. I moved to stand beside the dining table, letting them roam. The piles of documents I'd been sorting were gone, hidden safely the night before. Only neat stacks of unrelated papers remained. Household receipts, old bills, unimportant folders. I had learned enough from Adrian to know that information was power, and power was something you protected. Leon turned to me, irritation flaring. You need to stop pretending you understand any of this. Dad didn't tell you anything. He never trusted you with responsibility. I didn't answer. His words floated through the air, predictable and weightless. Marissa crossed her arms. We know how you operate. Quiet act. The innocent face. It fooled Dad for a while, but it doesn't fool us. She stepped closer. Too close. You think we don't see it. The way you're trying to twist things. Trying to make yourself look like the victim so you get everything. I watched her lips move, her outrage rising in practiced waves. I could almost hear Adrian in her tone, in her posture, in the way she leaned forward as if preparing to deliver a final, devastating blow. Children often repeat what they've been taught, and they had been taught cruelty with precision. Leon slammed his palm against the table. The kettle in the kitchen began to hum faintly, a soft, distant reminder that the world continued moving even when tempers flared. We're going to fight this, he warned. Legally, publicly, whatever it takes. Dad promised us everything. You won't trick your way through this. Their certainty was striking. Their anger almost rehearsed. I simply stood there listening, not correcting them, not defending myself, not offering a single word they could twist into a weapon. Silence, after all, had always been my greatest defense. Marissa scoffed when I didn't respond. Look at her, she said to her brother. Not even denying it. She thinks she's smarter than us because she's quiet. Smart wasn't the word for it. Prepared, maybe. Tired, certainly. But quiet. Quiet was instinct. Quiet was armor. Quiet was strategy. You'll regret this, Leon hissed as they moved toward the door. You can't hide behind that calm face forever. I followed them only to close the door behind them. Not slam it. Just close it gently, deliberately. Their footsteps echoed down the walkway, angry and confused. Their accusations lingered for a moment before dissolving into the stillness of the house. I didn't write their words down. I didn't need to. They were etched clearly enough in their expressions, in their desperation, in the tightening panic beneath their bravado. They were losing control. And they didn't know what to do with a woman who no longer lived under anyone's thumb. I locked the door softly, not out of fear but out of finality. Their move had been predictable. Their next one would be, too. And I was ready. The room was colder than before, as if someone had lowered the temperature to match the tension already settling over the long conference table. Everyone sat in stiff anticipation, the kind that makes people breathe too shallowly. Leon and Marissa were dressed in the kind of dark, somber clothes that looked less like mourning and more like strategy. They kept glancing at each other, exchanging confident little nods, certain this was the day everything returned to the order they believed belonged to them. Mr. Levine shuffled papers with slow, careful movements, clearing his throat more than necessary. He looked like a man carrying a secret wrapped in thorns. The will lay open before him, the legal pages crisp and heavy. He held one sheet between his fingers and adjusted his glasses, pausing long enough to make every heart in the room thump with impatience. We will now move to the final condition regarding the distribution of Mr. Hale's estate, he said, voice steady but tight. Leon straightened. Marissa crossed her legs with deliberate poise. I sat still, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the dust motes drift through the sunlight slicing across the table. The silence before the storm. Then he read it. The line that shifted the air so sharply it felt like glass breaking. If she smiles, she gets everything. The reaction was instant. A collective gasp, sharp and breathy, like the entire room had been struck across the face. Leon's mouth dropped open. Marissa's eyes snapped toward me with a disbelief so raw it almost looked like fear. Even the attorney hesitated, as if he needed a moment to accept that his own voice had just spoken those words aloud. It was Adrian's final trick. His final attempt to bind me even in death. A trap built with precision. If I cried, I lost everything. If I smiled, I gained everything. Either way, he imagined the moment would shape me in his image. Broken, obedient, performing emotions the way he dictated. A smile forced through humiliation, or a silence shattered by defeat. He wanted control. Even now. Especially now. I breathed in slowly. I could almost hear Adrian's voice in my mind, low and satisfied, expecting my reaction to ripple exactly as he intended. He imagined a trembling smile, a forced curve of lips born from desperation. He imagined I would be grateful for this final manipulation, grateful he had chosen me even in death. But he never understood what silence had taught me. He never understood what freedom felt like. And he certainly never understood that a woman who had survived him no longer bent under the weight of his games. I lifted my chin. I let the tension settle completely. And then I smiled. Not the smile he imagined. Not a trembling one. Not a grateful one. Not a performative one. Real one. A small, calm, steady smile, born not from his conditions, but from the simple truth that he no longer had power here. The room froze. My stepchildren stared as if the ground had disappeared beneath their feet. Their faces twisted into disbelief first, then anger, then something much darker, a dawning understanding that everything they believed was theirs had just slipped through their fingers. My smile didn't falter. It didn't widen. It didn't gloat. It was simply the expression of someone who had been held underwater for years and had finally surfaced, breathing her own air. Mr. Levine cleared his throat again, visibly relieved. As per his explicit instructions, the estate transfers in full to his wife. Leon shoved back his chair, sputtering something about fairness, about lawsuits, about fraud. Marissa demanded to see the original documents. They argued over each other, loud, frantic, unraveling faster than Adrian ever predicted. I let them speak. I had no need to join in. When they finally stormed out, voices echoing down the hallway, I remained seated, hands still folded, smile still gently resting on my lips. Not because I won. Not because of the money. Not because his condition favored me. I smiled because for the first time in years, I wasn't following his rules. I was simply living outside them. A smile he thought he controlled became the very thing that freed me from him completely. Freedom doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't burst through doors or shout its presence. It settles quietly, almost timidly, like a guest unsure if it's truly welcome. That was how it felt in the minutes after the meeting. Sitting alone in that conference room while Leon and Marissa's angry voices faded down the hallway, replaced by a stillness so complete I could finally hear my own breath again. For the first time, I felt the weight I'd been carrying for years lift, not all at once, but in slow, deliberate pieces. The smile that shifted the room, the one that changed the direction of everything, wasn't about winning. It wasn't about money or houses or accounts, or any of the things people assumed mattered. It wasn't triumph or victory or revenge. It wasn't even about proving Adrian wrong, though he would have hated knowing he failed. It was something simpler, something deeper, something entirely mine. It was the moment I understood, truly understood, that his rules no longer applied to me. For years, he shaped my reactions like clay, molding them through reward and punishment. A smile when he allowed it. Silence when he demanded it. Neutrality when emotions threatened the fragile order he pretended to maintain. Every part of me had been conditioned to fit inside the lines he drew. Lines that grew tighter and tighter until breathing felt like breaking a rule. And yet, the strangest thing happened when he died. The lines remained. The structure remained. The expectations remained. Not because he enforced them anymore, but because I had internalized them so deeply I struggled to move without imagining the consequences. The condition in his will was the final attempt to tighten those lines around me. One last twist, one last test, one last effort to see if he could reach into my life even from the grave and dictate who I was allowed to be. But when I smiled in that conference room, I did it without thinking of him, without hearing his voice, without bracing for criticism, without fear. My lips curved because they wanted to. My chest warmed because it could. My body moved in a way that wasn't rehearsed or calculated or measured against his preferences. I wasn't performing. I wasn't proving anything. I wasn't defying anyone. I was just me. It felt strange, like rediscovering an old photograph of myself taken before I knew what it meant to tiptoe through marriage. For a split second, I glimpsed the woman I might have been if he hadn't carved silence into my ribs. A woman who smiled because she felt like it, not because she was allowed to. Later, as I walked home, people stared the way they always did. Curious, pitying, hungry for gossip, but their looks didn't cling to me anymore. Their opinions no longer felt like shackles. The evening air brushed against my skin, cool and easy, and I realized I didn't need to hide anything. My smile wasn't a secret. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't conditional. It was mine. Inside the house, the ghosts of him lingered in every corner, but they didn't feel as menacing as they once had. The silence around me didn't echo his disappointment or criticism. Felt open, spacious, like a canvas instead of a cage. I stood in the center of the living room and let the truth settle fully. I wasn't smiling because I inherited his estate. I wasn't smiling because he gave me permission, or because I had outmaneuvered his children. I was smiling because for the first time, his shadow wasn't shaping the contours of my life. He tried to make my emotions another one of his conditions, another puzzle I had to solve to earn worthiness. But I didn't smile to pass his test. I smiled because he no longer had the power to make it a test at all. The news reached them faster than I expected. Maybe the attorney called them. Maybe they overheard something in the hallway. Or maybe they simply sensed it the way people sense a shift in weather, instinctively, suddenly, with a tightening in the chest. Whatever the reason, by the time I returned home from the distribution meeting, their car was already parked crookedly in the driveway, the engine still hot, the doors still open as if they had burst out mid-rage. They stood on the porch waiting, their faces contorted in disbelief that was curdling into fury. Leon paced like a man searching for something to hit. Marissa leaned against the railing, shaking her head with a bitter, disbelieving laugh that never quite turned into sound. The moment I stepped out of the car, they descended. Not with grief, not with confusion, but with accusation. "You knew," Leon snapped before I even reached the front steps. "You knew and you played us." I didn't respond. I simply walked toward the door. That infuriated him more than any argument would have. Marissa stepped in front of me, blocking the entrance with a tremor in her hands she was trying desperately to hide. "You smiled on purpose," she hissed. "Don't pretend otherwise. You manipulated the whole thing." Manipulated. A word I had heard 100 times from their father's mouth, though always directed at me for crimes I never committed. Now they tried to use it like a weapon, but the blade kept slipping in their hands. Leon moved closer, his breath sharp with anger. "We have every right to contest this. Dad would never leave everything to you unless you tricked him or coerced him." The accusation hung in the air, as absurd as it was desperate. Adrian had never been a man who could be coerced by anyone, especially not me. They knew it too, because the second the words left his mouth, even Leon looked unsure. But rage has a way of making people say things they don't believe, anything to justify the loss. They followed me as I stepped onto the porch. Their voices rose, tumbling over each other with insults meant to cut deep. Greedy. Fake. Soulless. One even dared to say I took advantage of their father in his final days, as if the man who commanded every corner of this house could have been outmaneuvered by someone he considered fragile. I listened without truly hearing. Their words washed over me like rain hitting a closed window, loud, relentless, but unable to reach me. Years ago, those words might have carved into me, filling me with guilt or doubt. Now they barely scratched the surface. I had lived too long in silence, too long under their father's control, to be pierced by echoes of his cruelty. When they realized their insults weren't landing the way they hoped, their anger grew sharper, more frantic. Marissa threatened a lawsuit. Leon claimed he had connections. They swore they would drag my name through the mud, expose me as a fraud, dig up anything they could twist into evidence. But as they stood there unraveling, the truth settled over their faces like a shadow. They knew. Deep down, beneath all the shouting and bravado, they knew the will was airtight. Their father had crafted it carefully, obsessively, with layers of legal precision that made challenging it nearly impossible. He didn't trust anyone. Not them. Not me. Not himself even. That was the irony they couldn't swallow. He had built a will that protected his final game so tightly, so meticulously, that even his own children couldn't escape the rules he designed. And they hated him for it almost as much as they hated me. After nearly half an hour of shouting, their voices began to crack, their fury collapsing under its own weight. Eventually the threats slowed. The insults thinned. The bravado drained from their eyes. All that remained was bitterness, raw, wounded, and helpless. They walked down the steps with stiff, furious movements, refusing to look back at me. The slam of their car doors echoed through the driveway like a final, defeated punctuation. Then they sped off, tires screeching, as if running from the truth that had finally caught up with them. When the noise faded, the world felt strangely quiet again. Not peaceful. Not yet. But honest. Their anger had exposed everything. Every selfish intention, every entitlement, every assumption. And for the first time they stood not as grieving children, but as exactly what they were. Two people who expected inheritance, not justice, control, not fairness, ownership, not truth. And they had lost it all. Not because of me. Because of him. And because they never saw the woman standing quietly in front of them as someone capable of surviving him. The house looked different the moment I stepped inside. Not because anything had physically changed, but because the air no longer tightened around me the way it used to. The walls didn't echo with instructions. The floors didn't creak with caution. The rooms didn't feel like stages where I had to perform quiet compliance. For the first time the house felt like a place I lived in, not a place I survived. I walked slowly, deliberately, letting my fingers brush over surfaces I once avoided touching. The leather armchair that had been strictly his. The bookshelf arranged by his preferences. The hallway mirror where I used to check whether my expression was appropriate before going downstairs. Without his presence, these objects became ordinary. No longer symbols of control, just things occupying space. I paused in front of the bookshelf, pulling out one of his favorite volumes. The pages were stiff, annotated with his small, precise handwriting. I realized I would never again have to pretend to agree with the opinions scribbled in the margins. I slid it back and closed the glass door. Over the next few days, I began moving through the house with purpose. I opened closet doors and drawers I had once approached as though they held traps. I pulled out suits he no longer needed, ties still twisted from the last time he wore them, shoes polished to a shine he used to admire. I folded each item and placed it into donation bags. Not angrily, not triumphantly, just calmly. Releasing them felt like releasing the weight they carried. Some things I kept, an old photograph from before everything hardened between us, a watch he wore on our first anniversary, a single letter he wrote during a business trip where, briefly, he sounded like a man trying. These weren't mementos of love exactly, but fragments of a life that wasn't entirely black or white. I didn't need to erase my past to build a future. I only needed to reclaim it. I opened the windows wide, letting fresh air push into every room. Curtains fluttered, light spilled across the floors, and for a moment the house felt startled, as if waking up from a long sleep. I moved furniture not because I needed to but because I finally could. Chairs angled toward the windows instead of the television. A vase placed on a table without worrying about it being misaligned. A blanket draped over the sofa without fear of mess. In the kitchen, I cooked a meal using too much garlic, too much heat, too much everything he used to monitor. The scent filled the house, warm and unapologetic. I sat at the table and ate slowly, savoring not the food, but the freedom woven into each bite. Day by day, I pieced together a life he never allowed me to imagine. I signed up for a pottery class. I reopened the garden he claimed was too much of a distraction. I reconnected with a friend he had pushed away. I let my sister visit as often as she wanted. Each act was quiet, gentle, but each one rewrote something inside me. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a soft amber glow across the living room, I stood in the center of the house and felt a stillness so different from the one I'd known for years. Not forced, not fearful, just peaceful. Silence I chose. And I understood something then, something simple and profound. My smile at the will reading hadn't been the end of his power. It had been the end of mine being hidden. His control didn't die when he did. It dissolved when I realized I no longer needed his approval, his rules, his conditions. The life ahead of me wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. It would grow the way a seed does beneath the soil, quietly, steadily, unseen until one day it breaks through the surface. And this time when I smiled, it belonged entirely to me.